The summer heat was brutal that Tuesday afternoon when Ben drove his old pickup truck into Cedar Falls. He needed supplies for his ranch, fence wire, feed, and maybe some new boots if he could find a decent pair. Ben had been living alone on his family's ranch for the past 8 years, ever since his father passed away. The 2,000-acre spread was a lot for one man to handle, but it was home. It was all he had left of his family's legacy. Ben parked outside Murphy's General Store and stepped onto the dusty sidewalk. Cedar Falls wasn't much of a town, just a main street with a few shops, a diner, and a gas station. Most folks knew each other, and Ben had been coming here for supplies since he was a boy riding alongside his father. People were friendly enough, though he sometimes caught whispers about the lonely black rancher who kept to himself up in the hills. As he walked toward the store, Ben heard shouting coming from the alley beside the old bank building. It wasn't unusual to hear arguments in town, but something about this one made him pause. The voice was slurred and angry, the kind of anger that came from too much drinking and too little sense. Ben had heard that tone before, and it never led anywhere good. "You're gonna do what I tell you, girl." "I don't care if you can't hear me. You better understand me." Ben stopped walking. Through the gap between buildings, he could see a man in his 50s stumbling around, waving his arms at a young woman who stood perfectly still. The girl looked to be in her late teens or early 20s with long brown hair that hung around her face like a curtain. She wasn't looking at the man. Instead, she stared straight ahead, her hands folded in front of her. "Daddy owes money, and you're gonna help me pay it back," the man continued, his voice getting louder. "These people want their cash, and I ain't got it. But you're young and pretty, and that's got to be worth something." Ben felt his stomach turn. He looked around the street, hoping to see Sheriff Martinez or someone else in authority, but the main street was nearly empty. A few people had gathered near the general store, watching the scene unfold, but nobody was moving to help. The drunk man, who Ben now recognized as Tommy Morrison from the gas station, grabbed the girl's arm and pulled her toward the street. She didn't resist, but Ben could see the fear in her posture. Her shoulders were hunched, and she kept her eyes down. "Come on, Lucy," Tommy slurred. "Time to meet some new friends." Ben had seen enough. He couldn't just stand there and watch this happen. His father had raised him to help people when they needed it, and this girl clearly needed help. He walked over to where Tommy was dragging the young woman. "Hey there, Tommy," Ben said, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Looks like you're having a rough day." Tommy turned around, squinting in the afternoon sun. His clothes were wrinkled and dirty, and the smell of alcohol hit Ben from several feet away. "Mind your own business, rancher. This ain't got nothing to do with you." "Maybe not," Ben replied, "but I couldn't help overhearing. Sounds like you got some financial troubles." Tommy's grip tightened on the girl's arm. "I owe some people money and they want it today. Gambling debts, you know. These boys don't mess around when it comes to collecting." Ben glanced at the girl, Lucy, Tommy had called her. She still wasn't looking at either of them, but he could see her hands shaking slightly. Something about her stillness bothered him. It wasn't natural. It was the kind of stillness that came from years of trying to be invisible. "How much money are we talking about?" Ben asked. Tommy laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. $3,000. "Might as well be $3 million for all the good it does me. But Lucy here, she's gonna help me work it off. There's folks who'd pay good money for a pretty girl, even if she can't hear nothing." The words hit Ben like a physical blow. He looked around again, hoping someone else would step in, but the small crowd that had gathered seemed content to watch from a distance. This was the kind of situation people talked about later, but never actually did anything about when it mattered. "Let me ask you something, Tommy," Ben said, stepping closer. "What if I paid off your debt instead?" Tommy's bloodshot eyes widened. "You'd do that? Why would you care about my problems?" Ben honestly wasn't sure why he was getting involved. Maybe it was because he knew what it felt like to be alone in the world. Maybe it was because he could see that this girl had nobody looking out for her. Or maybe it was just because his father had taught him that sometimes you have to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves. "Let's just say I don't like seeing people get hurt," Ben replied, "but I got conditions." You take my money? You pay off your debts and you leave this girl alone forever? Tommy looked confused. You mean you want to die her from me? I'm not buying anybody, Ben said firmly. I'm paying your debts so you'll stop trying to sell your daughter to strangers. There's a difference. Lucy still hadn't moved or looked up, but Ben noticed that her hands had stopped shaking. She was listening, even if she couldn't hear. Something about her stillness told him she was paying attention to everything happening around her. Tommy seemed to think it over, swaying slightly on his feet. $3,000 and you'll take her off my hands? I'll pay your debts, Ben corrected. And Lucy comes with me until we figure out a better situation for her. But I'm not buying a person, Tommy. Nobody owns anybody else. The drunk man nodded eagerly, probably not caring about the distinction as long as his money problems went away. Deal, let's go to the bank. Ben looked at Lucy, who was still staring at the ground. He couldn't tell if she understood what was happening, but he hoped she knew that someone was trying to help her. Lucy, he said gently, my name is Ben. I'm going to make sure you're safe, okay? She didn't respond, didn't even look up, but he thought he saw her nod just slightly. 20 minutes later, Ben had written a check to cover Tommy's gambling debts. The money came from his ranch savings, money he'd been planning to use for new equipment and repairs. But as he watched Tommy stumble away from the bank, already talking about finding a drink to celebrate, Ben knew he'd made the right choice. Lucy stood beside his truck, still quiet, still looking down. Ben wasn't sure what to do next. He'd acted on instinct, but now he had to figure out how to help someone he couldn't even talk to. He opened the passenger door and gestured for her to get in. As they drove away from Cedar Falls, Ben glanced over at the young woman sitting beside him. She was looking out the window now, watching the landscape change from small-town buildings to open fields and rolling hills. For the first time he could see her face clearly. She was pretty, but there was something old in her eyes, like she'd seen too much trouble for someone so young. Ben had no idea what he was going to do with a guest on his ranch, especially one who couldn't hear. But he knew one thing for certain: Lucy was going to be safe now. Whatever came next, she wouldn't have to face it alone. The drive back to the ranch took 40 minutes, and for most of it, neither Ben nor Lucy said a word. Ben kept glancing over at his passenger, wondering what she was thinking. Lucy sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the scenery roll by through the truck window. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the fields, and Ben could see her taking in every detail: the cattle grazing in distant pastures, the old oak trees that lined the dirt road, the mountains rising up in the background. When they finally reached the ranch house, Ben parked near the front porch and turned off the engine. The silence felt heavier now. He'd brought this young woman to his home, but he had no idea how to communicate with her or what she needed. All he knew was that she was safe now, and that had to be enough for the moment. Ben got out and walked around to open Lucy's door. She stepped down from the truck and looked around at the ranch with wide eyes. The main house was a simple 2-story building with white paint and a wraparound porch. To the left stood the barn, and beyond that were several smaller outbuildings and the corral where Ben kept his horses. The whole place had a quiet, peaceful feeling that Ben had always loved. "This is home," Ben said, even though he wasn't sure. She could hear him. He gestured toward the house and then pointed to himself. "My home." Lucy nodded, and Ben felt a small surge of hope. Maybe they could figure out how to communicate after all. He led her up the porch steps and into the house. The living room was simple but comfortable, with a stone fireplace and furniture that had seen better days. Family photos lined the mantelpiece, pictures of Ben's parents and grandparents who had built this ranch from nothing. Lucy walked over to the photos and studied them carefully, as if she was trying to understand the story they told. Ben showed her around the ground floor, the kitchen, the dining room, the small office where he kept his ranch records. Then he led her upstairs to the guest bedroom. It was a nice room with windows that looked out over the pastures, and it had its own small bathroom. Ben's mother had always kept it ready for visitors, though they rarely had any. "This can be your room," Ben said, setting down the small bag. of belongings that Tommy had given him for Lucy. It wasn't much, just a few changes of clothes and some personal items. "You'll be comfortable here." Lucy walked to the window and looked out at the view. The sun was getting lower now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She stood there for a long moment, and Ben wondered what she was thinking about. Was she scared, relieved, confused about why a stranger had brought her to his home? That evening, Ben cooked a simple dinner: grilled chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans from his garden. He wasn't much of a cook, but he managed to put together decent meals. He set 2 plates on the kitchen table and gestured for Lucy to sit down. She ate quietly, glancing up at him occasionally, but mostly keeping her eyes on her food. After dinner, Ben tried to figure out how to explain the situation to Lucy. He got a piece of paper and drew simple pictures: a stick figure that was supposed to be him, the ranch house, and another figure that represented her. He pointed to the drawings and then to themselves, trying to show that she was welcome to stay. Lucy watched his attempts with what might have been amusement, and she even smiled slightly when his drawing of a cow looked more like a potato with legs. Over the next few days, Ben and Lucy settled into a routine. Ben had to keep up with his regular ranch work, feeding the cattle, checking fences, maintaining equipment, and to his surprise, Lucy wanted to help. The first morning, she followed him out to the barn and watched as he fed the horses. When he handed her a bucket of oats, she took it without hesitation and started filling the feed troughs. Ben was amazed at how naturally Lucy took to ranch work. She seemed to understand what needed to be done without him having to explain much. When he was mucking out stalls, she grabbed a pitchfork and started helping. When he was checking the water troughs in the pasture, she walked alongside him, pointing out problems he might have missed. What surprised Ben most was how the animals reacted to Lucy. His horses, which were usually skittish around strangers, seemed completely comfortable with her. His old dog Rex, who barely tolerated most people, followed Lucy around like she was his best friend. Even the cattle, which normally scattered when people approached, seemed calm when Lucy was nearby. Lucy had a gift with animals that Ben had never seen before. She could walk up to a spooked horse and somehow calm it down just by being present. When one of his young calves got separated from its mother and was bawling in distress, Lucy simply stood near the fence, and within minutes the mother cow came looking for her baby. Ben started watching Lucy more carefully, trying to understand how she did it. She seemed to notice things that he missed: the way an animal held its head when it wasn't feeling well, the subtle changes in behavior. That meant trouble was coming. One afternoon, she led him to a section of fence where several cattle had gathered. Ben couldn't see anything wrong at first, but when he looked closer, he found a break in the wire that would have let the cattle wander onto the highway. The days passed. Ben found himself looking forward to Lucy's company. The ranch had been quiet for so long that he'd forgotten what it was like to have someone else around. Lucy didn't talk, of course, but her presence filled the empty spaces in ways Ben hadn't expected. She had a way of anticipating what he needed, handing him tools before he asked, opening gates at just the right moment, bringing him a cup of coffee when he was taking a break from work. In the evenings, they sat on the porch and watched the sunset. Ben would tell Lucy about the ranch, about his family's history, about the challenges of keeping a cattle operation running. He wasn't sure how much she understood, but she listened intently, sometimes nodding or shaking her head in response. To his stories, Ben also noticed that Lucy seemed to have an unusual ability to predict the weather. One morning, she refused to go outside, staying close to the house and looking anxious. Ben didn't understand why until the afternoon, when a severe thunderstorm rolled in without warning. Another time, she started bringing the horses into the barn, even though the sky was clear. Sure enough, hail started falling an hour later, but there were also moments that puzzled Ben. Sometimes Lucy would react to things in ways that didn't make sense for someone who couldn't hear. She'd turn around when a door creaked behind her, or she'd look up when a hawk cried overhead. Ben told himself that she was just very observant, that she was picking up on vibrations or other visual cues he wasn't noticing. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Lucy's story than he understood. She carried herself like someone who had learned to be very, very careful about everything around her. Even when she seemed relaxed, there was a tension in her shoulders, a readiness to disappear if things went wrong. Ben decided that whatever secrets Lucy was carrying, she would share them when she was ready. For now, it was enough that she was safe, that she was helping him with the ranch, and that neither of them had to be alone anymore. 3 weeks had passed since Lucy came to live on the ranch, and Ben was starting to notice things that didn't add up. Small things at first, moments that made him pause and wonder if he was seeing what he thought he was seeing. But as the days went on, these little incidents began to pile up in his mind like puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit together. Started on a Tuesday morning when Ben was fixing a loose board on the barn door. He'd been working quietly, trying not to disturb Lucy, who was brushing down his horse copper about 20 feet away. The old barn door had a habit of creaking, and Ben knew exactly which angle would make it squeal like a rusty gate. He was being careful to avoid that spot when the door slipped from his grip and let out a loud, sharp creak. Lucy spun around immediately. Ben froze with his hammer halfway to the nail. Lucy was looking straight at him, her eyes wide with concern, as if she'd heard the sound and wanted to make sure he was okay. But that was impossible, wasn't it? She was deaf. She'd been standing with her back to him, focused on the horse. There was no way she could have seen the door move or felt the vibration from that distance. When Lucy realized Ben was staring at her, she quickly turned back to copper and continued brushing, but Ben could see tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. He stood there for a long moment, hammer in hand, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe she'd felt the vibration through the ground, he told himself. Old barns were full of creaks and groans, and someone who couldn't hear might be extra sensitive to other things. It was a reasonable explanation, but something about it didn't feel right. The next incident happened 3 days later. Ben was in the equipment shed looking for a wrench when he accidentally knocked over a metal bucket. The thing hit the concrete floor with a crash that echoed through the whole building. Before the echo had even faded, Lucy appeared in the doorway, looking worried and slightly out of breath. "Everything okay in here?" She might have been asking with her expression, though of course she didn't say anything. Ben picked up the bucket and gave her a thumbs up, but his mind was racing. The shed was a good 50 yards from where Lucy had been working in the vegetable garden. How had she known something had fallen? How had she gotten there so fast? Ben started paying closer attention after that, and the more he watched, the more confused he became. Lucy seemed to have an uncanny ability to know when things were happening around the ranch, even when she wasn't looking. When his old truck backfired while he was driving up from the south pasture, Lucy was waiting on the porch when he got back, as if she'd known he might need help. When a coyote started howling in the distance one evening, Lucy immediately got up from where she'd been sitting and went to check on the chickens, but it wasn't just her reactions to sounds that puzzled Ben, it was also her reactions to his voice. Ben had gotten into the habit of talking to Lucy throughout the day, partly because the silence felt unnatural and partly because he hoped she might be reading his lips. He told her about his plans for the day, pointed out interesting things around the ranch, and shared stories about his family. Sometimes, when he was talking, Lucy would nod or shake her head in response to his questions, which made sense if she was reading his lips. But other times, she seemed to respond to things he said when she wasn't even looking at him. Once, he was walking behind her on the way to the barn and mentioned that it looked like rain was coming. Lucy immediately looked up at the sky and then hurried her pace, as if she'd heard his prediction and agreed with it. The most puzzling incident happened on a Saturday afternoon when Ben was working on his truck engine. He'd been struggling with a stubborn bolt for 20 minutes, muttering under his breath about cheap parts and poor design. Lucy was on the other side of the truck, supposedly organizing tools, when Ben finally lost his patience. "Come on, you piece of junk!" He shouted at the bolt, raising his voice louder than he'd intended. Lucy dropped the wrench she was holding. The tool hit the ground with a clang, and when Ben looked over at her, he saw something that made his chest tighten. Lucy had gone completely still, her whole body tense, and she was staring at the ground with an expression that looked almost like fear. "Lucy?" Ben said, this time keeping his voice soft and gentle. "You okay?" She didn't look up at first, but Ben could see her hands shaking slightly. It took several minutes before she seemed to relax, and when she finally met his eyes, there was something haunted in her expression that made Ben feel sick to his stomach. That night, Ben lay awake thinking about Lucy's reaction to his raised voice. She'd looked scared, genuinely scared, in a way that suggested she'd dealt with angry voices before. The thought of someone shouting at Lucy, maybe even hurting her, made Ben angry in a way he hadn't felt in years. But it also made him think harder about everything he'd been observing. If Lucy could hear him shout, did that mean she'd been hearing everything else too? The truck backfiring, the bucket falling, the door creaking, the coyote howling. And if she could hear all those things, why was she pretending that she couldn't? Ben started testing his theory, but carefully. He didn't want to scare Lucy or make her feel like he was trying to catch her in a lie. Instead, he began paying attention to the little things. When he spoke to her, he watched her reactions more closely. When unexpected sounds happened around the ranch, he noted how she responded. The pattern became clearer over the next week. Lucy definitely reacted to sounds, but only certain kinds of sounds. Loud, sudden noises seemed to startle her, especially when they happened behind her or when she couldn't see what was causing them. Angry voices, like when Ben had shouted at his truck, made her freeze up completely. But normal conversation, even when she wasn't looking at him, seemed to get some kind of response. It was as if Lucy could hear everything but was trying very hard to pretend that she couldn't. But why would someone do that? What reason would a person have for hiding their ability to hear? Ben thought about Lucy's father, the drunk man who had tried to sell his own daughter to pay off gambling debts. He remembered the way Tommy Morrison had grabbed Lucy's arm, the way he'd shouted at her, the way he'd talked about her like she was property instead of a person. A terrible thought began forming in Ben's mind. What if Lucy had learned to pretend to be deaf as a way to protect herself? What if ignoring the angry voices and cruel words had been her only defense against a father who saw her as a burden instead of a daughter? The idea made Ben feel sick, but it also made a horrible kind of sense. If Lucy had grown up in a house where hearing meant having to listen to threats and abuse, maybe pretending not to hear had been her way of surviving. Maybe it had started as a child's desperate attempt to escape from words that hurt, and over time it had become so natural that she couldn't stop doing it. Ben found himself watching Lucy with new eyes, looking for signs of the fear and pain she might be carrying. He noticed that she was always careful to position herself where she could see everything around her. She never sat with her back to a door, and she seemed most comfortable when she was outside in open spaces where nothing could sneak up on her. He also noticed that Lucy seemed to relax more each day, as if she was slowly learning to trust that the ranch was a safe place. But the pretense of deafness continued, and Ben began to understand that it might be the only protection Lucy knew how to rely on. Taking that away from her, even by letting her know that he'd figured out her secret, might feel like stripping away her last defense against a world that had never been kind to her. The storm hit on a Thursday night in early August, rolling in from the west like an angry beast. Ben had been watching the weather all afternoon, noting the way the wind picked up and how the cattle had started gathering under the trees. The air felt heavy and electric, the kind of atmosphere that promised a rough night ahead. Lucy had been restless all day. Ben noticed she kept looking toward the horizon, her face tight with worry. She'd helped him secure loose equipment and bring the horses into the barn, but there was something different about her movements. She seemed jumpy, distracted, like she was listening for something he couldn't hear. When the first rumble of thunder rolled across the valley, Ben was in the kitchen making coffee. It was a distant sound, barely audible, but it made him glance toward the window. The storm was still miles away, probably wouldn't reach them for another hour or two. That's when he heard the sound from upstairs. It wasn't loud, just a soft thump, like someone had dropped something on the floor. Ben set down his coffee cup and listened. Another thump, then what sounded like furniture being moved. Ben climbed the stairs and knocked gently on Lucy's bedroom door. "Lucy? You okay in there?" No answer, which wasn't unusual. Ben tried the door handle and found it unlocked. When he pushed the door open, he found Lucy sitting on the floor of her closet, pressed back against the wall with her knees drawn up to her chest. Her eyes were wide and fixed on the window, where lightning was beginning to flash in the distance. "Hey," Ben said softly, stepping into the room. "What's wrong?" Lucy didn't respond, but Ben could see she was breathing fast, almost hyperventilating. Another rumble of thunder crossed the sky, still distant but getting closer, and Lucy pressed herself harder against the closet wall. Ben had seen this kind of fear before in animals that had been mistreated. It was the look of something that expected pain and had nowhere to run. He sat down on the floor a few feet away from the closet, close enough to help but far enough away that Lucy wouldn't feel trapped. "It's just a storm," Ben said, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Nothing to worry about. The house is solid, been through plenty of storms before." The thunder came again, louder this time, and Lucy's whole body flinched. That's when Ben realized something that should have been obvious. Lucy was reacting to the thunder. She was hearing it, getting scared by it, just like anyone else would. There was no way she could be responding this strongly to something she couldn't hear. Ben felt his heart sink as the pieces clicked into place. All those little moments over the past month, all the inconsistencies he'd noticed but tried to explain away. Lucy could hear. She'd been able to hear all along. The storm was getting closer now, and the thunder was becoming a regular drumbeat across the sky. Each crash made Lucy curl up tighter, and Ben could see tears starting to roll down her cheeks. Whatever was happening to her, it was about more than just being scared of storms. "Lucy," Ben said gently, "I think you can hear me right now. And, I think you've been hearing me all along." Lucy's eyes snapped to his face, wide with something that looked like panic. For a moment, they just stared at each other, and Ben could see the truth written in her expression. She could hear him. She'd always been able to hear him. A massive crack of thunder shook the house, and Lucy let out a small cry of fear. The sound was so quiet Ben almost missed it, but it was definitely there. Lucy had made a sound, a real sound with her voice. "It's okay," Ben said, moving a little closer to the closet. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to tell anyone. I just want to help." Lucy was shaking now, whether from fear of the storm or fear of being discovered, Ben couldn't tell. The rain had started, hammering against the windows in sheets, and the thunder was coming every few seconds. But Ben had the feeling that Lucy's terror wasn't really about the weather. "How long have you been pretending?" Ben asked quietly. Lucy opened her mouth, then closed it again. She looked like she wanted to say something, but couldn't make the words come out. Another flash of lightning lit up the room, followed immediately by a crash of thunder so loud it seemed to shake the walls. "Please," Lucy whispered so quietly Ben almost didn't catch it. "Don't make me go back." It was the first time Ben had heard her voice, and it was nothing like he'd expected. It was soft and gentle, but also rough, like she hadn't used it in a long time. And the words she'd chosen told him everything he needed to know about why she'd been hiding. "You're not going anywhere," Ben said firmly. "This is your home now, for as long as you want it to be." Lucy looked at him with disbelief, as if she couldn't quite trust what she was hearing. "You mean that?" "I mean it," Ben said. "But I need to understand what's been happening. Why have you been pretending you can't hear?" The thunder crashed again, and Lucy flinched so hard she hit her head against the closet wall. That's when Ben realized that the storm wasn't just scaring her because of the noise. It was bringing back memories. Bad memories. "My father," Lucy said, her voice barely audible over the rain. "When he got drunk, he would yell, and when he yelled, bad things happened. I learned that if I pretended not to hear him, sometimes he would give up and leave me alone." Ben felt anger rising in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. "How long did you have to do that?" "Since I was little," Lucy said, "maybe 7 or 8 years old. He would scream at me, call me names, blame me for everything that went wrong in his life. But if I didn't react, if I just stood there like I couldn't hear him, sometimes he would get tired and stop." The pieces were falling into place now, and each one made Ben feel sicker. "And when other people were around?" "I had to." Keep pretending, Lucy said. If people knew I could hear, they would expect me to respond when my father yelled. They would wonder why I wasn't defending myself or talking back. It was easier to let everyone think I was deaf. Another crash of thunder shook the house, and Lucy pressed her hands over her ears. The thunder sounds like his voice when he was really angry. Loud and scary and like it's going to hurt you. Ben understood now why Lucy had been so afraid when he'd shouted at his truck that day. To her, any loud voice probably sounded like danger. Any sudden noise might mean someone was about to hurt her. Lucy, Ben said, you don't ever have to pretend. With me, you don't have to be afraid of making noise or talking or being yourself. This is a safe place. Lucy looked at him with tears streaming down her face. What if I forget how to stop pretending? What if I can't remember how to be normal? Then we'll figure it out together, Ben said. There's no rush. You can take as much time as you need. The storm was starting to move away now, the thunder becoming more distant, but Lucy was still shaking. Ben could see years of fear and pain in her eyes, and he realized that helping her heal was going to take more than just providing a safe place to live. Can you tell me your real name? Ben asked gently. Lucy wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. It's Lucy. That part was true. Lucy Catherine Morrison. Well, Lucy Catherine Morrison, Ben said, welcome to your new life. We'll take it one day at a time, and you never have to be scared of voices again. For the first time since he'd known her, Lucy smiled a real smile. It was small and tentative, but it was genuine. And when she spoke again, her voice was a little stronger. Thank you, she said. Thank you for saving me. The morning after the storm brought a different kind of quiet to the ranch. Lucy came down to breakfast, looking tired, but somehow lighter, as if sharing her secret had lifted a weight she'd been carrying for years. Ben was at the stove making pancakes when she entered the kitchen, and for the first time, she didn't jump when he spoke to her. Morning, Lucy, Ben said, glancing over his shoulder. How did you sleep? Better than I have in a long time, Lucy replied, her voice still. Soft, but clearer than it had been the night before. Thank you for staying with me during the storm. Ben had indeed stayed, sitting on the floor outside her closet until the thunder moved on and Lucy felt safe enough to come out. They'd talked for hours after that, with Lucy sharing pieces of her story and Ben listening without judgment. It was the beginning of something neither of them had expected, real conversation, real connection. Over the next few weeks, Lucy slowly began to find her voice again. At first, she only spoke when they were alone, and even then, she kept her words quiet and careful. Years of silence had made talking feel strange and risky. But Ben was patient, never pushing her to say more than she was comfortable with. I feel like I'm learning how to be a person again, Lucy told him one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. I'd almost forgotten what my own voice sounded like. Ben could hear the wonder in her tone, mixed with sadness for all the years she'd lost. You don't have to rush anything, he said. We'll take it as slow as you need. The biggest challenge was helping Lucy learn to trust that loud voices didn't automatically mean danger. Ben had always been a quiet man, but he made an extra effort to keep his tone gentle and warn Lucy when he needed to raise his voice for practical reasons. I'm going to call to the horses in the far pasture now, he'd say. It's going to be loud, but it's not angry loud. Gradually, Lucy began to understand the difference between Ben's working voice and the angry shouting she'd grown up with. When he called to the cattle or talked to Rex from across the yard, she stopped flinching. When he laughed at something funny on the radio, she even started to smile instead of looking worried. But the real breakthrough came when Lucy decided she wanted to learn to read properly. She'd missed a lot of school because of her father's drinking and the need to maintain her deaf act around teachers and other adults. Her reading was basic, and her writing was even worse. I want to understand things better, she told Ben one day, frustrated after struggling with a simple magazine article. I want to be smart. You are smart, Ben said firmly. You just haven't had the chance to show it. Ben drove to town and came back with a truck full of books, everything from children's stories to adult novels, plus workbooks for reading and math. He'd also stopped by the library and asked the librarian for advice on helping someone catch up on their education. Lucy threw herself into learning with an enthusiasm that amazed Ben. She'd sit at the kitchen table for hours, working through reading exercises and practicing her writing. When she came across words she didn't know, she'd ask Ben to explain them. When she finished a book, no matter how simple, she'd tell him about the story with excitement in her voice. "I never knew there were so many words," she said one afternoon, looking up from a dictionary. "So many ways to say things." Ben watched her discover the joy of language and felt proud in a way he'd never experienced before. Lucy was like a flower that had been kept in darkness suddenly blooming in the sunlight. Every day brought new growth, new confidence, new reasons to smile. As Lucy became more comfortable with speaking, she also began to share more about her dreams and hopes. She'd always loved animals, she told Ben, but she'd never imagined she could actually work with them professionally. She'd thought her future was limited to whatever life her father chose for her. "What if I could become a veterinarian?" she asked one day, the words coming out in a rush as if she was afraid to say them too slowly. "I know it's probably impossible, but what if I could?" "Nothing's impossible," Ben said. "It would take time and a lot of studying, but if that's what you want, we'll figure out how to make it happen." Lucy's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears this time. "You really think I could do it?" "I think you could do anything you set your mind to," Ben said. And he meant it. They started planning Lucy's future together. She would need to get her GED first, then apply to college. It would mean years of hard work and probably some time away from the ranch for schooling. But Ben was committed to helping her achieve whatever goals she set for herself. As autumn arrived, Lucy had transformed from the silent, frightened girl Ben had rescued into a confident young woman who laughed freely and spoke her mind. She still preferred quiet conversations to loud gatherings, and sudden noises could still startle her, but the constant fear was gone. The ranch had changed too. Lucy's presence had brought life to the old house in ways Ben hadn't expected. She'd planted flowers around the porch, organized his cluttered office, and filled the rooms with the sound of her humming while she worked. The loneliness that had haunted Ben for years had disappeared completely. One evening, as they sat together reviewing Lucy's college preparation books, she looked up at him with a serious expression. "Ben," she said, "I need to tell you something." "Important." Ben felt a flutter of worry. "What is it?" "I want to stay here," Lucy said. "Not just until I finish school, but after that too. This ranch, this life with you, it's the first place I've ever felt like I belonged. If you'll have me, I want to make this my permanent home." Ben felt his throat tighten with emotion. Over the months he'd grown to care for Lucy like family. But he'd assumed that once she found her feet, she'd want to build a life somewhere else. The thought of her staying, of continuing to share the ranch and their quiet evenings together, filled him with a happiness he'd almost forgotten was possible. "Lucy," he said, "there's nothing I'd like more. This place has been waiting for someone like you. My parents built this ranch to be a home for family, and that's what you are now. Family." Lucy smiled, and Ben could see the relief and joy in her expression. "So we're partners then?" "In the ranch and in everything, partners," Ben agreed. "In everything." As winter approached, Lucy was already making plans for expanding the ranch's operations. She wanted to add chickens and maybe some goats. She had ideas for improving the pasture management and thoughts about which crops might grow well in their soil. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Ben found himself more excited about the ranch's future than he'd been in years. The scared, silent girl who had arrived on his ranch 6 months earlier was gone, replaced by a strong, confident woman who knew her own mind and wasn't afraid to use her voice. Lucy had found more than just safety at the ranch. She'd found herself, and Ben had found something he'd thought was lost forever, a reason to look forward to tomorrow, and someone to share all his tomorrows with.